part of the grief is to say, these are the things we regret. Like, these are the things that we are sorry for. And these are the ways that maybe we weren't faithful all the time. And we are going to receive God's forgiveness in that. It's also saying thank you, thank you, thank you to each other, to the community, and to be able to say that the love that we share in God is going to continue on, even if the church as we know it does not.
Welcome to the Last Service Podcast. I'm your host, Matt. You may have heard that American churches are closing at a pace faster than new churches are opening. In fact, it is estimated that over 4,000 churches will close this year. The need for thoughtful conversations about the declining church in America is more crucial than ever, and I've got some questions. Are these dying churches a tragedy, or is it an inevitable part of a church's life cycle? What happens when a church closes? How do we pastor and lead a dying church? And how can a declining church end well? On this podcast, we explore the stories of American churches that have closed, consolidated, or merged. But this isn't a tale of despair. It's a celebration of good endings, enduring legacies, and the courage to embrace new beginnings. This is not the end. Folks, my guest today is Reverend Diane Kenaston from Good Friday Collaborative. Diane, welcome. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you so much, Matt, for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here. I am Diane Kenaston, the co-founder of the Good Friday Collaborative, your partner in the sacred work of congregational endings. The Good Friday Collaborative supports churches concluding ministry through closing, merging, or consolidating, restarting, or relocating. I am a United Methodist pastor, writer, and coach. I'm currently based out of New Haven, Connecticut, although I have lived in England, St. Louis, Atlanta, and West Virginia over the last 15 years of ministry. And my husband, kindergarten son, and I landed in Connecticut last summer. We are now hoping to stay here for a while.
Oh, that's great. Hey, what part of Atlanta were you in?
I went to seminary at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. Yes,
Very
indeed.
Good. Ooh, you are the second Candler grad that we have had
wonderful.
on this podcast. That's exciting.
Yes, it's a great school.
Good.
Yeah. So, and I'm passionate about supporting last pastors. That's a term that comes from Gail Cafferata. And last pastors are the people who are leading their congregations to complete ministry. And I'm passionate about supporting last pastors because I've been one. When the church I pastored chose to conclude their existing ministry, they were completing their mission. The Holy Spirit was very much at work with them, and they called their merger their new birth. They were such an amazingly faithful congregation. And at the same time, their faithfulness wasn't always the first thing that people saw. And too often, other people just saw failure. I even had a denominational official tell me that he refused to celebrate failure and that he always walks out of the room when closed churches are recognized at our annual conference. So I know your face tells it all.
Wow. Yeah. Hang on. Go walk me through that again. Okay. So this person, who is this person that does not want to celebrate?
So this was a person who was supposed to be working with our congregation to help us explore our options for the future.
Oh,
and
no.
As part of that, he said that he refused to celebrate failure, and basically said that closing would be a failure, but also felt that closing was the only option. It was really just a narrow view of what new life and resurrection can mean in a struggling congregation.
That's a very polite way of putting it. That sounds like a delightful person. Anyway.
Yes. Yes. So, well, as a result of that experience and many others, because it wasn't just one person, right? Like you're getting that as a pastor, you're getting that from like lots and lots of people. And I really feel that my calling now is to help change that narrative of congregational endings from failure to faithfulness. And this is why I'm so glad to be part of the Last Service podcast, because I think that this is part of your work and what you're doing is changing this narrative from failure to faithfulness.
Absolutely. We certainly hope so. Well, let's dive into Good Friday Collaborative. How did this come about? You said a little bit about your how you became passionate about it and what led you to it, but how did the collaborative itself come together?
Yes. So as I went through leading a congregation to conclude ministry, I realized that I needed help from people who knew what they were talking about and people who would respect the decisions of the congregation, whatever those decisions were, whether it's revitalization or relocating or restarting or aging in place or closing, whatever the option is. I think we need to be able to respect what a congregation chooses. So I called people who had been through concluding ministry before and those who are also currently going through it. And I really don't know how I would have gotten through my own experience of completing ministry without these other folks. And two of the people I called, they had each led 2 congregations to conclude ministry by the time they were 30 years old.
Wow.
Yes. And actually, there's our statistics that show and data that shows that young pastors and first call pastors are more likely to lead congregations to completion because they tend to be going into congregations that might already be struggling before they get there, that are having low financial resources, and they're finally willing to take a chance on an experienced pastor. So this is a really common phenomenon.
That makes sense. I had never thought of that, but of course, yeah, it's pastors right out of seminary who would tend to get those appointments. Do you all have those statistics on your website? I would love to.
Those are not on our website, but in Gail Cafarata's book, The Last Pastor, she gets into that. And I do have an article up at Faith and Leadership magazine, which is through Duke Divinity, about the stained glass ceiling for pastors, for last pastors, and particularly how it affects young women and young people and first call pastors. Okay, man, that's going to be a whole episode in and of itself. I think that's a fascinating problem. But what I just can't imagine. Let's just say I'm older than my late 20s. I can't imagine looking back what I was like in that period, bearing that weight, particularly for a historic congregation that's been around for generations. I mean, that's a tremendous burden and challenge. It is. Wow. It is. And I was fortunate in that I was in my 10th year of ministry at this point. So I was in my mid 30s. But I was calling people who had been through it before, and they just happened to have gone through it really early and learned the hard way of what not to do. And I benefited from their wisdom. Yeah. Well, good. Okay. Continue the story with. Yes, absolutely. All that to say is that there are things that you can learn from books, but there are other things you can only learn from other people who've been through it. And I really needed a supportive community of people who had gone through it and could say, you're not alone. They could hold my tears, answer my questions, and promise that there was new life on the other side. So following the merger that I led in the summer of 2021, my family moved to England, and I spent some time praying and discerning about what was next for me vocationally, and eventually called the other people who had helped me through it and asked them to pray too. And this became the origins of the Good Friday Collaborative. All right. And who makes up the Good Friday Collaborative? Right. Yeah. So we have the Reverend Sarah Nave Fisher, the Reverend Lauren Radzik, and the Reverend Chelsea Hillier. Fantastic. So, what services do you provide? What's your goal and your aim? Yes. So we work with pastors and congregational leaders, as well as regional leaders who want to be strategic about congregational endings in their areas. Through our coaching and consulting and online course, we help congregations move from crisis to spiritual growth, from conflict to consensus, and from trauma to wholeness. We are really concerned about bringing a pastoral heart to this so that the congregation members aren't having to ask themselves, were we unfaithful or was God unfaithful? But to really help people see this in a new way, to say, oh, we can be faithful and experience this death and resurrection because this is part of our faith. And we work especially with pastors and other key congregational leaders. We help to prevent burnout or push out, help strengthen them for resilience. Because again, some of the other studies about what happens to last pastors is they tend to leave pastoral ministry entirely. If they're old enough for early retirement, they take that. And if they're not, then they tend to just go on leave of absence for a while. So we want to make sure that we strengthen the pastors who are going through it so that they're equipped to figure out what is God calling them to next in a really healthy, non-traumatized way. Yeah. And then we help Go ahead.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you're working with regional leaders. So that's up a level denominationally.
Yes.
Honestly, don't know what that's called I guess it's a conference in the Methodist
Yeah.
Church.
So
Is that right?
districts
Okay.
or conference in United Methodism,
Yeah.
we're an ecumenical group.
Presbyteries.
So presbyteries,
Yeah.
Associations, regions, they all have different terms, synods, depending
Right.
on the denomination. But really saying, let's just not have an approach where, oh, this church here closes one year and this church over here closes the next year. But can we actually think about how we can be strategic in cultivating conversations that need to happen in similar timelines?
Yeah. Okay. That's great. I've gotten the impression there's not a lot happening at the denominational level to address the coming wave of church closings that is being anticipated. So it's encouraging to hear that you all are reaching out to that. I hope that work is going well.
Yes, and we're seeing ourselves coming alongside denominations that are overworked and overburdened,
right,
and they have so many of these leaders, regional leaders, have so much on their minds. Then the congregations that are really, really struggling sometimes fall through the cracks, and so we want to help with that.
Yeah, good. If you've been a part of a church closing or merger, I want to hear your story. Reach out to me at lastservicepodcast@gmail.com. We'll schedule a time to talk and see if your testimony could be a source of inspiration for other churches and other church leaders. Okay, speaking of denominations, let's tackle this. Good Friday Collaborative is comprised of ordained women. For the purposes of this podcast, I want to reach a variety of denominations. Not all denominations ordain women, but all denominations, with the exception of maybe Pentecostal denominations, are facing decline at the moment, which means we're kind of all in this boat together. And I haven't come across a denomination yet that's really ahead of the game, planning ahead. So take a second and let's just build a bridge here. For denominations, people with denominations who are listening who might not ordain women, what would you say to them if they need your services? How can you work with them?
Yeah. Well, like you said, we are absolutely all in this together. Especially in the United States and in kind of white Western Christianity, we're having to say goodbye to the church that has been in order to welcome the church that God is bringing forth. And you're right, we're seeing this shift affecting churches across the spectrum, from Quaker to Catholic to evangelical to mainline. And this diversity means that there's no one size fits all approach to concluding ministry. So our ethos is collaborative. Again, we're all in this together, and we offer what we have to anyone. We're ecumenical, meaning that we equip the whole Church of God from every denomination and tradition. At the same time, we do so as we are, as people made in the image of God, called by Jesus to pastoral ministry, and gifted by the Holy Spirit for that work. And we're unapologetic about that. So if someone is unwilling to work with an ordained clergywoman, then we're probably not the organization for you. Yeah. But for everyone else, we do offer free exploratory calls to help you discern whether our resources would be a good fit for your context. And most of the time, we're working behind the scenes with one or two key leaders through individual coaching or our online course. So this can make it really easy to work across dividing lines, because you're not bringing us up in front of your congregation. Like, we're equipping you as the leader to be in front of your congregation and lead them. And as they say in 12 steps, take what you need and leave the rest. So our role is always to help our clients to thrive in their contexts. And we bring our wisdom and experience, and we know God has called us to this work, and we are who we are.
That's great to hear. All right. One of the things that stood out to me when I was first looking through your website was that, as you said, each of you at the Collaborative have walked this journey before. So this podcast at its heart is a storytelling podcast. So I'd love for you to tell me the story of the church that you led through merger.
Yes. So the congregation that I served, I arrived there in July of 2014. 1 month, this was in St. Louis, Missouri, and 1 month later, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, just a few miles away.
Oh, wow.
And that deeply shaped my experience of St. Louis, and it also really shaped the congregation, because this was a congregation that had been founded in 1910 as an all-white congregation in a whites-only neighborhood in St. Louis. And their history paralleled the history of white people in the municipality that they were in. So you could actually trace their membership growth and decline exactly parallel to the membership growth and decline in the community around them, and especially parallel the presence of white people in the community. So they had made the deliberate decision in the 1960s and 70s to stay in the community, even though white flight had hit them hard. They said, our calling is to be in this community, and our calling is to integrate. And so they did that, but they didn't really fully become a multiracial or multicultural congregation. It was more of a like, they can join us approach to integration, or desegregation is really what it was. And then over the years, they continued to try to figure out, okay, what does it mean for us to be the church in this community, and how do we think about this? They got their first African-American pastor in the early 90s. That was one of the first cross-racial appointments in that area for United Methodist. And they struggled because people left, right? Like these are hard transitions. But they still were faithful and still saying, okay, how do we continue to live in the community that God's called us to, even though now our members have moved out to the suburbs, they're driving back in, we're still white dominant. There was a lot of like white privilege that they hadn't really looked at or wrestled with, and just a lot of confusion about their posture and how they could approach the community. And they had done a lot of work before I arrived, and they said they wanted to become a multiracial, multicultural congregation. And after Michael Brown was killed, they were really challenged on that, because suddenly it was, oh, we can't just be nice white people, and I'm putting that in quotes, but like we actually have to live out our anti-racist commitments. And so we did a deep dive into white supremacy kind of embedded in our own lives and in our institution. What does this mean? And exploring all of this calling, and begin to say, how do we shift power so its power is not just concentrated among white folk? Like we revamped our food pantries so that we had a multiracial board of people, both pantry neighbors who were receiving food from the pantry and pantry volunteers who were mostly church members, and giving them equal power and say over everything with the food pantry, that type of thing. Yeah. But all of this work was hard and difficult as they began moving forward. And then they also began having conversations that said, we are still continuing as a congregation as a result of like accumulated white wealth in many instances. They had an endowment that had been started several decades earlier, each year drawing a little bit more and more from those investments. We had a sister congregation that was an African-American congregation that was struggling hugely financially because they didn't have those emergency things to back on. Like when their boiler broke, they couldn't just fix it. When our boiler broke, we would take money from the endowment and fix it.
Right. Tell me about sister congregation. What does that mean?
So it was another church within United Methodism they actually ended up doing a merger themselves a few years after we did. But we were our consolidation or merger ended up being kind of rushed, and we weren't able to merge with them. But that was one of the questions that we first had when we began thinking about our own future, was, okay, what does it mean for us to give up our own identity in order to be a new, the church that God is calling us to be? Because it kind of came to a point where it's like, we can't just make little shifts. We need to have a complete revisioning of who we are and what we're called to do.
Right.
So those were all some of the factors in that particular congregation. Alongside that, we also had, we were relying on a smaller number of givers who were then giving more and more and more. Like we had really amazingly generous givers. But it set us up so that if any of those givers died or moved away, then the church at huge risk. And that was part of what then shaped where we were going. Let's see. So in 2019, in December of 2019, the congregation adopted a deficit budget that pulled more down from the investments in the endowment than they really felt comfortable doing. Like, it was not a sustainable amount, but did so saying, we want to spend the next year figuring out our options so that we can make a strategic decision on how we're going to move forward. Because in the past, what they would have done is they just would have said, oh, well, we have this deficit of $30,000. We need to cut a part-time staff member. And they didn't want to do that. They could see that this wasn't a one-time issue, and that people were really giving so generously. And people were just exhausted. So rather than saying, let's cut staff in order to keep the building, let's spend a year where we really dive into what is strategic for our congregation to do.
Yeah.
So we had those meetings in like December and January about this deficit budget, to say we're going to spend the year looking at this. And then in March, the COVID pandemic began. That accelerated our decline. It didn't change the trajectory that we were on. And then by September, we began having all church conversations about what are the future options that we want. And the congregation was really, really excited about relocating and restarting as a multiracial congregation. Bringing a church planter in and starting that. But due to the timing with the pandemic and some denominational politics, that just wasn't able to happen. But we had gotten to grips with our need to leave the building because the building was huge, right? The building was built for a time when they used to have 100 people in the youth choir, and like the youth choir could just like all fit on the front steps of the sanctuary. And
Whoa.
then now we had like less than 100 people in worship each week.
Oh, wow. So how big was the sanctuary? How many would it seat?
So we had taken a bunch of pews out and things. So I think that the sanctuary seating officially was like 300. But we had like taken out a whole section to have like a play area for children and that cool. type of thing through the years. And again, this was a church that had it had children, it had money, it had a passion and heart for the community, and there were fewer and fewer people who were maintaining the church and continuing to like make it run. We had a trustee who'd been the trustee for decades, and she had she had literally patched up most of the building, just through her volunteer labor. I mean, she was dedicating 20, 30, 40 hours a week to like doing trustee work unpaid. And was 85 and was like, I know I can't do this once I turn 90,
oh gosh. Yeah. So the physical exhaustion as well as the
physical exhaustion as well as that emotional exhaustion. And back in 2014, back in 2010, so a few years before I arrived, they had gone from 2 full-time clergy to just 1 full-time clergy person. Mm-hmm. And they never really recovered from that, because they had all of these decades of being used to having 2 full-time clergy who were doing so much ministry, and then switching to being 1 full-time clergy person was just a really difficult switch.
Okay, that's interesting. Was the reason to switch financial, or was there another thought? Okay.
It was almost entirely financial. And one of the things that then affected our own discernment was that decision was made by the board and then communicated to the congregation, so that it was a shock to the congregation. And so it was a really painful leaving or letting go of that second pastor. Ooh, okay. And so there was a lot of needing to rebuild trust that are the leaders paying attention to the finances? Are we actually looking at our annual audits? Are we communicating well in advance of this is what we're going to do?
Sure.
And so my first few years there, we really focused on trust building and kind of regaining trust between the congregation and the elected leaders, and looking and saying we are always going to signal what the issue
When a
is
big change is coming. Yeah.
when a big change is coming, and that there's nothing is going to be like sprung on you. There don't need to be surprises on this.
No. Yeah. So, okay. So it may have been a wise decision financially but it wasn't communicated well enough in advance. So there was some hurt there, but it also sounds like that second clergy person was doing a lot of work that then didn't get picked up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because this was a really busy congregation. People were just maxed out. Like they had no margin in any parts of their lives. And so we had people who were incredibly dedicated to the church, but they didn't have any more hours or in the day in order to give any more to the church. And so, and I believe in Sabbath rest. I believe that God doesn't call us to be workaholics, and like that includes in the church. So, how do we create a congregational community that is life-giving and not life-draining?
Yeah.
So we began our conversations. No. And so that was fall of 2020. We're doing all of this over Zoom. It was really hard. But I also felt that the discernment maybe was harder because we were doing it over Zoom and online church and everything. But in some ways, the actual transition to something new was going to be easier because we already had that like shock to the system of, we're not in our holy place right now. Yeah. And then we decided to begin the merger process with a church that was about a mile down the road. That they had conversations off and on for like, I don't know, since the 1960s, saying we should merge with this church.
Since the 1960s.
60s, yes. Yeah.
Oh.
My very first week pastoring this church, I had a member of the congregation come in and say, we need to merge with Grace. And I was like, I just got here. Like, I don't even know your name yet. Can you?
I mean, that's kind of,
slow down.
There's a sweetness to that there's been this love between two congregations for that long. And maybe I'm painting that a rosy picture, but
so there was some love and practicality, but honestly, there was not enough humility for the first 5 decades that they talked about it for it to happen. Yeah, of course. And so what really, really happened was the congregation that I served got to the point where they had to say, okay, God is calling us to something new that's probably away from this building, because this building felt like an albatross. And are we willing to give up our name, our identity, our building in order to kind of follow Jesus into the future? And when they were able to do that and kind of have that spirit, that completely changed the way that we were able to then have a merger.
Yeah, it's amazing how, I don't want to imply that COVID was a blessing, but it forced conversations that were already coming for a lot of congregations. Yes. And it's, I don't know that you could even look at COVID as like the reason churches closed necessarily. But it did move things along that was, like you said, you were already on the trajectory. So
absolutely.
Anyway, continue the story.
Yes. So we voted unanimously to pursue merger. And in our context, in our denomination, we did do like a 2-step vote. So a vote to enter into merger conversations, and then later another vote to approve the merger proposal. And then on Pentecost Sunday that year, which was in May, we began our legacy services and had completed so that the new church was ready to start on July 1st of 2021. Tell me about
legacy services. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So we're a series of.
Yeah. So both I and this congregation could be a little bit extra. So you're going to see that here. Okay. We have all of these legacy worship services described in our online resource drive, so that we have so that other people can copy these and imitate them if they want to.
Oh, cool.
But we started on Pentecost Sunday. We invited back all of the former pastors and music directors from the church. A number of them were able to come or send letters on Pentecost. Others came back during the remaining weeks in the series. And we were able to celebrate the movement of the Spirit over 111 years of church history, and how we were continuing to follow the Spirit's lead. That was really important to us. It was that we've had this good news that we've received and this good news that we're passing on. The Holy Spirit has been present in our past, and the Holy Spirit is present now and will be in the future. The following week, we had a building prayer walk where we went around in COVID-safe small groups all over the building and prayed in each space of the building, and remembered different aspects that were there. People had a chance to talk and pray, and then concluded with like a little picnic outside. On our third week, we had a mission celebration, and this was, I believe, everybody's favorite service because we just gave away as much money as we possibly could.
That's fun.
Yeah, it was so fun. And we did it all in multiples of 111. Well, sort of multiples. It was like we would give like $1,111 to this organization and $11,111 to that organization. Wow. So we gave away between like $50,000 and $100,000 on that Sunday. We had all kinds of testimonies and special guests, and with each of those gifts, we connected it to how the congregation had been actively engaged in these ministries of justice and peace for decades. We had on the fourth week, we had a staff farewell, because one of the things that isn't always talked about in congregations completing ministry is that you are actually saying goodbye to a pastor and your staff members, as well as to the church itself. And so we made sure that the music director, who had been there for about 10 years, and I, who'd been there for 7 years, and our administrative assistant, like we were all able to be recognized by the congregation, to share our words to the congregation. And we had a pastoral intern there that year as well, who helped with this. We shared the liturgy for pastoral transitions, common our denomination. That week, we'd also flown in an old music director, who had been there in the 70s and was in her 90s then. She had written a hymn that is in our United Methodist hymnal. That has always been like one of like the really special, powerful hymns for this congregation, because they know the hymn writer. So she came in and we and she played the hymn for the closing hymn for that service. It was so powerful. And we had a baptism that Sunday, because it was coming out of COVID, and there was a baby been born during that time who hadn't had a chance to even meet this church family yet. And it was so important to the family and to the church family that baptism happened in the same place where his parents had gotten married years before, where we could all say, you're baptized not just into this one faith community, you're baptized in the whole body of Christ. And that continues no matter what.
Wow.
So that was kind of our most reflective service, in which we had the most tears. The following week, we had more of a celebratory service that was it was a service in 2 locations, in our building first, and then going to the other building, to our new church home. And it was really interesting because the other congregation actually joined us for the first half of the service, and they were crying the whole time. Like they were, and the rest of us were like, all right, let's get going. We had done a lot of the intense grieving over the previous weeks. And we were able to ritually carry important objects, sacred objects, from one church to the other, as well as symbolic objects of things that meant a lot to the congregation.
Yeah, that's neat. You were able to do that. Mm-hmm.
And then on the last week, we had our first official service as a merged congregation, and I preached at that. That was also my last Sunday, and the church was able to kind of say, okay, this is who we are now, and this is how we're going into the future.
That's amazing. I love that. A series of services. It's great that you all had the time and really had the resources to be able to plan it out that way. I think that speaks to how far ahead you were able to get on this. And that's not a good way to put it. I think that speaks to the lack of desperation with which you were able to proceed. Is that true?
Yes. And I would say that's part of what I really am passionate about with the Good Friday Collaborative, is that so many of the people who come to us, they're at the point of desperation. They're saying we can only pay our pastor for another 3 weeks, or we can, like, we are running out of financial resources, and we don't know what the options are. Or we're running out of people resources. We're exhausted. And if you're going to, if you're really going to be courageous, can you have the conversations earlier? And can you say, maybe God is calling us to something new, and let's dedicate time to that now.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Last Service podcast. Hey, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you can stay updated for upcoming episode. Okay, that's all. Back to the story.
As you reflect on this process, and you've turned that period into so many good things that you can share with other people, but I'd love to hear from you briefly just a couple of things that went really well and a couple of lessons that you learned that you might share with another congregation of, hey, don't do that, or maybe try that a different way.
That is a great question. I would say that giving time for grieving is really important, and giving time for hope and resurrection, that you have to have both, and those things have to go together. And so when we had 6 weeks of legacy services, we were looking at, how do we grieve the building? How do we grieve the staff and the pastor? How do we look forward with celebration for the wonderful legacy that we've had? And how do we look forward to the legacy that we're going to have as part of this new church?
It's fantastic. And what were some things that you might recommend doing differently?
The time scale that we were on was
sure.
too fast.
Yeah.
And that was dictated by some forces outside of our congregational control. But we had, because of how the denomination works, we had to have everything set and ready to go by July 1st. Which meant that we pulled off a merger between the end of January and June. And that's just, I think that's too fast to have a fully equitable merger in which the new church is able to, the newly merged church is able to think about, how are we going to be a church into the future? And so there were still a lot of questions, even as we celebrated what was going to come, that weren't able to be resolved, that we said, okay, this will be resolved later. And I wish we hadn't put those things off, but there was just only so much capacity for things. So one of the things we did, because the church that we were merging into had plenty of money, both churches had investments. So we were very clear that we wanted to give away as much money as we could, like that was one of the values of the congregation. And so one of the things we did was we designated a certain amount for the legacy church that I was part of, to say this will be used for reparations, but it's going to be up to the newly merged church to figure out what that is. Because if you're going to do racial reparations, you have to be in relationship, and you have to figure out how to do that justly. So that was something that, like, we really wanted to figure out prior to concluding existing ministry, but that was something that was then just kind of transferred on as a designated fund to the new congregation.
Yeah. You described a period of about 6 months of this before you said 5 transition services, 5 legacy services?
Yes. Yeah.
So 6 months, 5 services, and that still felt fast. So for folks listening, these things take a lot of time. You were fortunate to get ahead of it. You were fortunate to have resources that could carry you through, and you were able to bless some other organizations. So yeah, just highlighting that, being able to make decisions in a lack of desperation, because it just takes time.
And the earlier you start, the more creative you're able to be. Earlier you start, the more able to really bless bless the congregation, bless each other, bless the community. And I think that's really important because we want to be intentional about our decisions.
That is the perfect transition to talking about a fantastic resource that the Good Friday Collaborative has put together. I love this so much. This is great. I haven't read anything else like it, which is pretty phenomenal. And it is the 5 stages of church closings. If you are listening and you are a part of a congregation that is starting to think about its future, the first thing I would recommend you do, well, pray. Second thing you should do is go to goodfridaycollaborative.com, sign up for the email list, and get this resource. It's really just a great framework. So I'd love to go through each of these 5 stages and unpack them a little bit, so we know kind of what you guys are thinking and what you've seen. And the first one is quiet wondering. Tell us about that.
So quiet wondering is when you first think, oof, I don't know if this church is going to be here in 20 years. There's a lot of quiet wondering that's happening. And the reason we call it the quiet wondering stage is because people aren't saying it out loud, or a few people might be saying it out loud and everybody else just sort of hushes them. And that's what I did to the church member who came into my office my first week there and said, we need to merge with this church down the street. And I was like, I just got here. No. And this quiet wondering, this is the time when you know something's off. There's maybe increased anxiety, and you if you're the pastor, you look out from the pulpit and just you see the empty seats in the sanctuary, and you're like, I know that where 2 or 3 are gathered, God is with us, and this is 2 or 3 people in a huge building, right? It gets really hard. It's when you're trying all these church growth strategies, and maybe you even tried them for decades, and yet attendance is down, money is short, the future is uncertain, and people are just tired. It's harder and harder to recruit new leaders. You have this passion for mission, you have this passion for the gospel, but you find yourself just coming into more and more meetings about like, well, how do we cut the budget, and how do we recruit Sunday school teachers, and as the church focuses on that, it becomes less likely that new people become part of the community. It's a negative feedback loop. Once you can get out of this quiet wondering stage, I think that you can begin to really look at your options. Mark Ellison was on this podcast early on. He's amazing. And he'll say you need 3 to 5 years to really get some of the transformative resources that his organization offers. You need a longer runway to deal with redevelopment of property and that type of thing. So like this quiet wondering stage, the whole point for us is to say, this is a stage. The shorter you make the stage, the more options you have on down the road. Yeah.
Why? There's no answer to this, but I'd love to hear your take on it. Why is it quiet? What is the stigma? What is it that makes us not want to talk about this? Because it would be a lot easier if this was just the wondering stage. That sounds a lot more fun, doesn't it? Let's just have a wondering stage. But that's not how it works. Why do you think that is?
So I think that it's death anxiety. There's a great theory all about death anxiety and how that changes our approach to things. So when we have invested ourselves into an institution, that becomes almost a symbol of immortality for us. Like the church is something that is going to live on after us. And the idea that the church isn't going to live on after us, it makes us wonder, like, what have we invested into? What have we done here? It raises issues of our own mortality of, okay, we're not leaving a legacy. Are we not investing in something that's going to live on? And in the same way that we don't want to talk about human mortality, we also don't want to talk about church death and church closure as well. So I think that that's a large part of it, is just this fear of failure, a fear of endings, and we should be good as Christians. We should be able to approach those endings with courage. But instead, we're just like throwing spaghetti against the wall, trying everything to get this local church to continue. And I think there's this fear that if we stop that, then what's left?
The great irony is that we are people who believe in the resurrection and still fear the death of our organizations.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
All right.
and yeah, and I would also say for clergy, there is also there's this sense of vocational pride sometimes that comes in too.
Oh, sure.
Because you and as well as your financial security, like that's also baked in
Of course,
as well. And so those are dynamics I think just to name, because they're not always named in these conversations.
Yeah. Let's go on to the next stage, naming and normalizing. This is the stage that I really hope this podcast can live in and help.
Yes, I love it.
Tell us about it.
So naming and normalizing is when you begin speaking the words more confidently and more often about, I wonder what's going to happen in the future. And I think it's really important also to say you need to name and normalize without shame or stigma, because a lot of times people are like, well, we talked about if you don't do this, the church is going to close. And there are so many books and resources, particularly because church revitalization is a big business. Everybody wants to revitalize their church. Sure. And so many times that revitalization is actually framed as a do this or else. And so that's not really naming and normalizing in a stigma-free way. I think what I want to see happen is to say, these are all of your options. Can you choose without stigma any of these options? I like to think of it as when somebody enters hospice. A doctor's job is not to say you must enter hospice or you must do chemo. If, like, let's say it's cancer that is stage 4 and they're trying to decide, like, do I do palliative care or not? The doctor's role is to say, these are all of the ways this could play out for you. This is the advantage of this course of option. This is the advantage of this course of option. And these are the disadvantages here. And then if an individual or a congregation chooses hospice, chooses palliative care, comfort measures, then that shouldn't be stigmatized. And if someone chooses the chemo, if somebody chooses like the super hard work of revitalization, like that shouldn't be stigmatized either. We just need to like look at, these are all of the options in front of us, and how do we compassionately say, you do have options, but let's be conscious about choosing one of them. That's
a really great analogy. So is the pastor the doctor in this scenario? And is it wise for the pastor to bring this up first? Should the pastor be the first to name it? It feels like leading, but that also feels really dangerous.
I really love this book by Gail Irwin called Toward the Better Country, Church Closure and Resurrection. And for people who are on our newsletter list, you can get an annotated book list of all the books we recommend through our newsletter. But in Gail Irwin's book, she makes a case for whoever has this on their heart is the person who needs to bring it up. So if you are the pastor and God is putting this on your heart, you need to bring this up. If you are a lay person and God is putting this on your heart, you need to bring it up. And if you are a regional leader, particularly in connected denominations, and God is laying this on your heart, you need to bring it up. So it could come from any of those sources. Somebody has to say it.
But that is scary. And I don't want to do the scary thing.
It is.
What I want to do is say it's somebody else's job.
It is really scary. Good thing God does not give us a spirit of timidity.
Oh, there it is. There it is.
I would also say, though, because you're moving from this quiet wondering stage to the naming and normalizing stage, you're not the only person wondering. And you may find when you speak that people are relieved because someone has finally said it. And that same thing happens again when people are aging, when people are entering hospice, when they're so many times people are just waiting. They're like, we know something is wrong, but they're waiting for the medical professional to say this may be time to start hospice. And then there's a relief because they're saying, okay, we can do this now. Like it's horrible and hard and you don't want it. And there's relief because it's finally been named and it's finally out in the open.
Your feedback means the world to me. Would you please take a moment and leave a review on your preferred podcast platform? It's going to help us grow and we'll reach more listeners who might benefit from these conversations. Thanks so much. Okay, so our next stage is the intentional decision making.
Right. So intentional decision making is when you're going through a formal discernment process. And this is going to go better if you spent enough time in the naming and normalizing stage. One of the things that is a challenge is if people are going from quiet wondering to, okay, we've got to vote on whether to close.
Oh, that's
like
a
super
very
fast.
Good point. Yeah.
That's going to be so much harder. But if you've had a chance to spend a year maybe talking about, oh, this congregation that we've saw, they closed and restarted, and this is what their new life looks like. Or just being able to talk through, this is this last pastor podcast that I've listened to, and these are some stories that I've heard about. What do we want to think through? Do you think this could be us? All of those ways that you have been naming and normalizing, that's going to make that intentional decision making so much easier. I think intentional decision making can go off the rails if it seems like there's a foregone conclusion. And I think this is true for any sort of discernment, is that we need to approach discernment, approaching God with like open hands to say, okay, God, like we're really praying for you to guide us right now. And we think these are the options. This is what we are going to explore, but we're listening for you. And so that intentional decision-making stage is going to go better when you're leaning on your own tradition and the forms of discernment that are best in your tradition, when you are spending time to hear from everyone, and also not letting the person who has the most grief stop all of the decisions for everybody. Like, so how are you caring for people who are grieving so that even in grief, you can still be making decisions?
That is incredibly important. And it's really refreshing when I come across folks who have approached it that way, because I think that solves so many other issues that can pop up.
Right.
So along those lines, I'm curious about the role of shame in this stage. In the previous two stages, we talked about shame, and it seems that it often leads to avoidance, where it's the quiet wondering, not going to name it. We're scared when we do name it. Or like you said, we're going to go quickly from the wondering to let's just get this done, which in a way is an avoidance, right? Like,
yes.
What other ways can shame sort of derail the decision-making or intentionality here?
In the Good Friday Collaborative, we like to call them the good idea fairies.
Okay.
These are the people who maybe have not even been involved in the congregation for a long time, who then pop up with some really good ideas. And this can, because they haven't been there for that quiet wondering. They've not been there for the naming and normalizing. And they are just like, how do we bargain, right? If you think about the grief stages, which isn't a perfect grief model, but bargaining is one of those. And so the bargaining is, if I give $7,000, can you hire a capital campaign consultant? And then we can do a capital campaign, and then we won't need to make this decision. And when I had somebody call me to say, I could give you $7,000, I was like, thanks, but no thanks. Like I will run these numbers. I will take this back to the board. But one of the things that we said in our discernment was, even if we had $1 million, like we still would need to be making these same decisions because we're exhausted, and this isn't a faithful use of our resources right now. And we're called to like look at what else is happening. And so good idea fairies, I think, are a way that shame pops up. And a lot of times too, I think it's when people are like, oh, I haven't been paying attention, I haven't been giving regularly. And these are sometimes children of founding members and that type of stuff. Like
Yeah. Oh, if I'd invested sooner, maybe I could have helped. Yeah. Interesting. All right. Planning for final ministry.
So planning for final ministry, this overlaps some with intentional decision
Of course,
making,
yeah.
because sometimes people need to know the plan before they can make a decision. But this is where you're really looking at all of the things in the building, right? Stuff. There is so much stuff in a 111-year-old building, and what are you going to do with it all? What you're looking at, how you care for staff. Are you able to give severance? What does that look like? How are you handing people off? So if you're not merging into another church, but you're just closing entirely, who's going to care for your members at home, the homebound members, after the closure? How are you going to talk about all of this with the children in the congregation? How are you going to preserve the archives, like the actual historical record of the congregation? What's going to happen to all of the finances? Who's going to be the person to kind of like sign off and close the bank account? And who's going to audit everything to make sure that money just doesn't walk in the process of closing? Because you got to still be good, responsible stewards during all of this. Are you going to sell the building if you still have a building? How is that decision happening? I mean, they're just huge planning questions that happen in this stage. And that's where I think the Good Friday Collaborative can offer a lot of resources and help with some of those things. We don't give legal or financial advice, but we can say, this is something you need to talk to a lawyer about.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. As you said before, in your experience, the congregation was physically and emotionally exhausted. And when you get to the planning stage, it seems very wise to me to have help, because you can't just tackle another endless to-do list. Things are going to go wrong when people are very tired and emotionally exhausted. So they should call you and get help.
Yes. And hopefully they can call earlier in the process too.
Well, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're heading toward a very long list of things that need to be done by people who are exhausted. So get help early for sure. Okay. And then leading final ministry.
Yeah. So this is that completion moment. This is where if you have a closing service, or sometimes we actually recommend 2 closing services. My colleague Lauren likes to conceptualize those as like a public service and a private service. So a private service in which you're really the comparison could be the graveside service for a family, and the public service is like the celebration of life for the whole community. And so thinking about how you're balancing that, or you can be super extra and have 6 services like I did.
I love that. I think that's great. It takes time.
It does, but it's not just the worship services. It's also, how do you thank the people who've gone on this journey with you? So that in my context, I had the most amazing leadership team you could ever ask for. And so as we entered that final week, we went out to dinner for our closing meeting. We needed to make like 1 or 2 kind of formal votes, but we shared communion together. We spent time thanking each other for all of the work that we had done. Our theme throughout that Lent and Easter season had been transformation through like a caterpillar kind of transforming and flying. And so I gave everyone a little caterpillar ornaments out of stained glass, because they were so distraught about leaving the stained glass windows in the sanctuary. But just able to say, how are you saying goodbye to key people? We had a big lunch for everyone who came to our food pantry, and all of the food pantry volunteers and board members, just really saying, how do we say thank you over and over and over again? These are all elements of leading final ministry. So it's not just the worship service. It's everything.
Yeah.
And then there is a 6th stage that we don't talk about a lot, but it is kind of what I would call aftercare, particularly for clergy, because once you've kind of gone through this, sometimes pastors are just like running through and they're setting aside their own feelings sometimes during the process, and then everything stops and you really feel everything at that point. And it's similar again to a funeral, where everybody comes in for the funeral and then they leave, and the person who's closest to the grief is just like, oh, this is this is what life is like now. And so part of leading final ministry and the aftercare is one of the things that we want to make sure we care for people in the Good Friday Collaborative.
Yeah. What classes in seminary prepared you for that? Yeah, that's my point.
I was going to say definitely pastoral care
well, sure, yeah.
And learning to lead a funeral and all of that. But yeah, this is not something you're taught in seminary, even though it is really common, and it's just going to be more and more common. Okay,
so this is a wonderful resource. The Stages. My personality is the type that I look at this list and I'm like, okay, if I'm leading a congregation, I'm going to check these boxes and we're going to move from one stage to this. But I'm betting that's not the right way to use this tool. So how can we use this tool in a more organic way?
Well, I actually am laughing because we're a collaborative and we bring 4 different perspectives to this. And so we went around and around about this because there are some of us in the collaborative who are checkbox people.
Yeah.
and that's the way that they think and the way they structure. And then we have other people in the collaborative who are everything is a cycle and you come back to this stage and that stage. And so yes, use it in a way that is intuitive for you, that matches your own personality approach. I would say, with our online course, which just launched right after Easter, which we're very excited about, we've really focused on moving from one stage to the next, because it's really easy to get stuck in a stage, and we want to help you move forward through it. So if people who are part of the online course have videos that go along with each of the stages, they're relatively short videos that are bite-sized and kind of distill our best wisdom that we can, and then you might want to come back to that course over and over the course of a year or 2 years or 3 months, depending on whether you're really stuck for time. But making sure that you're thinking about your own self, your own feelings, because we can't show up as differentiated, non-anxious leaders if we haven't done our own internal work about what we're feeling and where we're going.
I could ask 1,000 more questions, but in the interest of time, I think let's.
Well, I'm happy to come back.
yeah, we'll have to do that. Let's wrap up with 2 just big picture questions. I'm always curious of people's responses to this. Do you think that church closing is inevitable, or is it possible for a church to keep revitalizing?
So I do think that revitalization is an ending in itself. And that's one of the things that we don't always talk about is that if you revitalize, you are ending the previous ways of doing things. And that is also hard. And so just naming like, this is going to be hard. That is an ending as well. Our church closure is inevitable. If you zoom way out, 1,000 years, eternity out, yes, church closures are inevitable. Every single individual church is eventually going to close. When I read the book of Revelation, after the first 3 chapters, but the vision of what's happening, like Revelation 7 and 20 and 21, all of that, we don't have individual local churches that are gathered around the throne. We have the body of Christ gathered together around the throne. And we are baptized into Christ's death and resurrection. And so we're baptized into endings and new beginnings. So the individual local churches, they all have a time limit. Dying is inevitable. And so church closure just is a fact. But that's way big picture.
Sure.
Or yes, none of these churches are going to exist when Christ comes in final glory.
Yeah.
Or, sorry, after Christ comes in final glory.
Yeah, right. Well, yes. That's a totally different topic.
Yeah.
We're not going there. I like that. I hadn't thought of that before, but yes, the 7 churches and the 7 lampstands and all of that. What I usually say or hear said is that those aren't around anymore. But we just pointed out is that if we read Revelation as prophetic, it's saying they're not going to be distinct later on. Mm-hmm. That's a good thing to note.
Right. Yeah. So I think it involves this understanding, the discerning the body of Christ, like understanding that a local church is a part of the body of Christ, but it's not the whole body of Christ. And so the body of Christ is going to continue on, even if the individual parts do not. And in a body, my body today, like the cells are dying and there are new cells replacing it all the time. Like that's part of how bodies work. And I think it's part of how the body of Christ works as well.
All right. Last question. Paint us a picture of a good and faithful ending for a church. What does that look like to you?
A good and faithful ending is one in which the congregation has an opportunity to say, thank you, I love you, I'm sorry, and I forgive you. And I think that's the same thing as for an individual to say, I'm sorry, I forgive you, thank you, I love you. Those are the 4 tasks that we need to say prior to our individual deaths. And I think that happens in congregational endings and deaths as well. So part of the grief is to say, these are the things we regret. Like, these are the things that we are sorry for this. And these are the ways that maybe we weren't faithful all the time. And we are going to receive God's forgiveness in that. It's also saying thank you to each other, to the community, and to be able to say that the love that we share in God is going to continue on, even if the church as we know it does not.
Well, Reverend Kenaston, thank you for being a good shepherd, a good pastor to not only your congregations, but to many others that are benefiting from the wisdom that you all brought together. And thank you for your time today. Any final words?
I just really hope to get to meet folks. We have exploratory conversations for free. So if people would like to have 30 more minutes of me in their ears, just sign up on the website and we will. I would love to listen to other stories and help guide them through their next steps as they move through these stages.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Last Service podcast. Here are my 3 takeaways for leaders in a church that is declining. 1, many pastors at declining congregations are relatively young and in the first half of their career. Closing a church earlier in life could profoundly impact the pastor's career for decades. Do what you can to provide spiritual aftercare for the pastor who has guided a congregation through merger or closure. It will impact future generations of the church. Number 2. Good Friday Collaborative's 5 stages of closure is an invaluable framework for the spiritual, emotional, and logistical path to ending well. Read it and study it long before your church is in decline. And number 3, Reverend Kenaston's church was beautifully intentional about every aspect of their merger despite their exhaustion. I'm sure it wasn't perfect, but they found joy during their grief. They made decisions in keeping with where they believed God had called them until their final service. And then they were made into something new. Those are my 3 takeaways for this episode. I hope this episode brought you wisdom, inspiration, and peace. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our podcast and stay updated on upcoming episodes. Please take a moment to leave a review. It helps us grow and reach more listeners who might benefit from these conversations. If you have been a part of a church closing or consolidation, I want to hear your story. Reach out to me at lastservicepodcast@gmail.com. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. This is not the end.